Hello and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor. I am the host for this podcast in which we delve into controversial and important topics in the history of the Catholic Church. This episode is episode 2 of a new series on Catholic Liberalism, a movement which started in 19th century France and which will go up to the end of the 19th century. And so in this episode 2 is called Revolutionary Times, 1789 to 1848. We're going to give you a little bit of background I think you need to have to understand where it comes from, where this Catholic liberal movement comes from, and what the sources of its ideas and everything come from. So that's what we're doing in today's episode. Before we get started, please check us out if you haven't already. You can subscribe to the podcast on a variety of different platforms. Anchor is my podcast host. iTunes, Spotify. Also on YouTube, please go to the channel, subscribe. Please leave comments. I try to respond. If you have any suggestions for anything, I am open to them. And also visit us on a Facebook page as well. I also post announcements there for everybody about the podcast and things going on. And the website, churchcontroversies.com. I'm posting more things there now. I just posted an article recently. I also recently posted the bibliography of works from my last podcast on the Ukraine. So if you at all interested because of what's going on in the Ukraine right now, go in there and look at some books for you. A little bit of a brief bibliography describing some works for you. So please check us out, like, subscribe, and please share with other people. Let them know about what I'm doing here. So spread the word and help get the podcast out there. Blessings to you all. I'm recording this on Wednesday of Holy Week, Spy Wednesday. And today we're going to talk about revolution in this podcast because you really can't understand Catholic liberalism and where it comes from without understanding its legacy for the French Church especially. Now, if you remember last time, we talked about Catholic liberalism being a movement which wanted to embrace the idea that the Church would effectively embrace separation of church and state, embrace renouncing its political and legal privileges. And all this goes back to the French Revolution. So I'll give you a little bit of a timeline here. First of all, if you don't know, I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably know something about the French Revolution. We'll give you a timeline and make a few points with regards to the church for its legacy. As I'm sure hopefully you know, if you don't know much about it, the French Revolution began in 1789. The French monarchy was on the brink of bankruptcy. The absolute monarchy, which ruled without any sort of parliament for 175 years, simply couldn't find a political solution to raise money, so they decided to, do something they hadn't done in 175 years, call for a parliament, call for a meeting of the Estates General, which is the name of the old medieval French parliament. They have elections, they are sent to Paris, and if you don't know how the Estates General, what's called the Estates General, it's called estates because you didn't have members representing their geographic areas meet in an assembly like you're familiar with from Congress or from a modern parliament. They're meeting as estates, as members of the body politic. There are 3 estates in French law: peasantry, nobility, and the clergy. And that's how they met. However, when they got to Paris, you had a lot of people in the Third Estate who they outnumbered the other two orders, but they voted by order. So the other 2 orders could sort of outvote the much bigger, much more numerous body of people, which is symbolic, of course, because there's a lot more peasantry than there is anything else in France. And so what happened is the members of the Third Estate, led by some politicians, basically declared themselves to be a national assembly in June of 1789. And they urged the other 2 estates to join them to form a national assembly. I'm emphasizing this because this is the revolution, ultimately. The king and the other 2 estates kind of hold out for a few weeks, but they know they can't. After a while, they have to give in. The other 2 orders are actually ordered to join the Third Estate, and this becomes a national assembly. Why is that the revolution? Because basically they are claiming to represent the nation itself, that assembly, not the king. And this will become clear fairly quickly within a few years, and that's where you lead to violence and bloodshed between supporters of the monarchy and supporters of the revolution. But this National Assembly does a few things almost right away. In August of 1789, it abolishes all feudal privileges. That order of estates is based on essentially medieval feudal ideas. It abolishes all those privileges for the church, for the nobility, for everybody. And it passes it issues a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, equal universal rights for everybody. And so this is the revolution in its beginnings. It's a wiping away of this older order, which of course privileged the church. The same time, almost at the same time, again, they still have debt problems. In the fall of 1789, starting in October, they begin, in the name of the nation, as the National Assembly, expropriating church lands and issuing documents called assignats, which are sort of like a currency based on, future parcels of land you're going to get, I guess, in order to try to pay off its debts. So almost immediately you go from, because the church, by the way, is by far the biggest landholder in the country. And certain people have been resentful of their wealth for a long time. But because now the church is part of the nation, in 1790, acting in a way that French kings had before, just to clarify, kings had always in France exercised a lot of power over the church. The National Assembly passes something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790, which basically reorganizes the church along the lines of the state, literally physically. The boundaries of bishoprics and dioceses are redrawn to match the new map of the country. Bishops are going to be appointed. Well, this is partly a thing here. They're supposed to be appointed by the government. A lot of times they were under the monarchy. It's not as big of a change as anything else. But one of the things that this, to give you an idea of how radical a restructuring this was, it also threw open the office of parish priest to the election of parishioners. And not just, by the way, people who were members of the parish, but anyone who lived in a parish, Catholic or not. Could be Protestants, Jewish people, atheists. This is, by the way, I mentioned this because this is where the revolution kind of goes off the rails and begins to split, because there's been unanimity up until this point. The Pope takes a year because he doesn't want to do the thing too precipitous, but the Pope at the time, Pius VI, will condemn it in 1791. And early on, it begins to cause real division. So in the next year, the National Assembly issues an oath of loyalty to the Civil Constitution of the Clergy to all the priests in the country. And it splits the clergy in half. About 52% of the clergy take this oath, 48% refuse it. And this is the beginning of a permanent division, not just in the clergy, but in the country itself. There's an historian named Timothy Tackett who years ago did a study on this. If you break down the areas in France, where clergy refused to take the oath, and you match it up to voting patterns, like up through the 1960s in France, for conservative areas, they're almost identical. This will predict the breakdown of politics for the next 200 years, basically, in France. It's such a bitterly divisive thing. And they go one step further. That they also issue the next year. It's a different assembly, different name by then. But after they abolish the monarchy, the revolutionary government issues an oath of liberty and equality, demanding that all the clergy take an oath to defend liberty and equality and to defend the regime with their lives. And again, there's also a big split over this. It causes a big permanent bitterness and division amongst the clergy, because you have some who take it, who get called soumissières, submissives, because they took it, they submitted to it, and others who didn't, insoumissières. So you have this permanent divisioning open up within the clergy itself, bitter divisions. And of course, I'm going to speed over all the stuff that you probably have heard of. Oh yeah, the church was really badly persecuted, starting in 1793 with the abolition of the monarchy, the execution of Louis XVI, the monarch. Churches are closed, seminaries are shut down, priests and nuns are executed, martyred. I won't belabor this, but 1793-94 is a bad couple of years. Even after this, when there's a reaction against the Reign of Terror, which sets in 1794, there's still sporadic persecution. There's still attempts, by the way, to replace the church, to create, a religion of reason, to create festivals of reason and stuff like this. Multiple attempts to create a replacement religion based on rationalistic, supposedly non-superstitious lines. All through the next 4 or 5 years until 1799, when first you have one coup d'etat. The Abbé Sieyès was a longtime politician, manages to overthrow the Directory. In turn, of course, a few months later, the 18th Brumaire, that's the new revolutionary calendar that was put into place. Anyway, long story. A young general named Napoleon Bonaparte takes over in 1799. This is when things begin to sort of shift for the church a little bit. The persecution basically ends at that point. And because Napoleon is an upstart, he needs as much support as he can get, as much legitimacy as he can get. So he signs a concordat with the papacy in 1801, which basically gives church legal status again within France, announcing that it is not the official religion of the country, but the religion of the majority of the people of France. And so it doesn't quite restore it to what it was before. Never, by the way, restores any of its property. That never comes back. You can go all through France today and see, ruined abbeys, ruined churches all over the place. That destruction is still visible in France to this day, but did give it a place within the regime. But also basically it's almost explicitly denied that papal jurisdiction can be sort of exercised in France. So things got really cold pretty quickly between Pius VII, the Pope, and Napoleon, such that in 1808, Napoleon invaded Italy and conquered the Papal States, announcing they were annexed to France in 1809. In response to which, Pius VII very bravely excommunicated him and the entire army. In response, Napoleon took him prisoner for the next 5 years. By the way, if you want to know more about Pius VII, I actually have a podcast on that, podcast episode, part of the Catholic Live series on Pius VII, the Pope who excommunicated Napoleon. In any event, this didn't turn out well for Napoleon. The powers unite around him, yada yada. 1814, the Congress of Vienna gets together. There's the first defeat of Napoleon in 1814. He's sent off to Elba. And Pius VII is released in 1814. Next year, of course, Napoleon escapes, comes back. He's defeated at Waterloo. And for the final time, Pius VII is restored to the Papal States. And the Papal States are restored to him, as also, by the way, in 70 years later, 1814, restored also are the Jesuits, who'd been kiboshed back in the 1770s. They're brought back by Pius VII. Two other dates you'll need to know. I'll come back to this in ensuing episodes, but there'll be 2 more revolutions in the first part of the 19th century. Revolution 1830, a liberal revolution. We'll come to that later on. The so-called July Revolution of 1830, and then the revolutions of 1848, which begin in Paris, more of a liberal revolution, another liberal revolution, I should say. That's for another time. That's the basic timeline we're talking about here. And it's out of all this that you get liberalism emerging. And in fact, even though the French Revolution is at the heart of all this, the term liberal or liberalism, or certainly liberals as a sort of political program, political party, doesn't come from the French language. It comes from Spain. During the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon occupied Spain. His brother was on the throne of Spain from 1808 to 1813. And during that period, you had some members of the Spanish Cortes. Cortes is the parliament of Spain. And they were influenced by French Enlightenment ideas, and they first had a group of them who they came to be called liberales because they wanted to reduce the church's privileges. Even though most of them were committed Roman Catholics, and most of the changes they were making were fairly minor. They got that term, liberales, to be free, basically trying to free, I guess, the state from the church a little bit. However, in 1820, after Napoleon's been done away with, these liberales in Spain come to power in a military coup. And there's two factions among them, a more moderate faction and a more radical one. And what happens is the radical faction gets the upper hand. They begin attacking the church in the ways reminiscent of the French Revolution, attacking clergy, destroying churches, stuff like this. And this lasts for 3 years, and it only ends in 1823 when the restored French monarchy, which is brought back in 1815 after Napoleon's done away with, the restored Bourbon dynasty, sends an army to Spain and puts a stop to it there, restores the Spanish monarchy there. So it's all part of this sort of matrix. And just a few words, by the way, about the term liberalism. It comes into being in this period. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first use of the word liberalism in the English language, in the sense of a definite political program emphasizing individual rights and that sort of thing, dates to 1816 from an English newspaper account of political events in Spain. The word comes into French around the same time, about 1818, more or less. Of course, the term liberal, by the way, before this, going back centuries, had denoted the term liberal meant someone who's generous of character, someone who's free from servility or base things. By the 1750s, in France, it applied to people who supported reform and individual rights. And it was used in that same sense in Britain for at least the 1780s. After the Napoleonic Wars in Britain, people started using that term to smear politicians who with being, radical anti-monarchists, like some of the French were on the continent. So it became a polemical term in British affairs. Interestingly enough, the first use of the term liberal in reference specifically to theology and specifically to a willingness to jettison traditional beliefs doesn't come from any of these European countries. It comes from America, according to the OED, in 1807. So that's what liberalism, I guess, as a term, comes first from America, which is interesting. The first use of the term liberal applied to someone in terms of their theology also comes in the United States. So interesting that it's not just a European thing, but again, Catholic liberalism has sources that are kind of, I don't say universal, but they're having in different places at different times, is my point. And finally, in terms of what was restored in 1815, just to wrap this up, when the Bourbons were restored in 1815, it came along with a parliament. They tried to bring back the absolute monarchy. They just couldn't do it. But they did want to prop up the regime. And but they also gave it a parliament which had political parties of a kind. And it had the normal sort of spectrum you would expect. I mean, again, most of our political terminology comes from France, left and right. That's a French thing. On the far right, you had ultras or reactionaries who wanted the absolute monarchy restored, followed by more moderate but still conservative monarchists. And on the left, you had a mixture of all sorts of things. On the very far were people who wanted the revolution back. But you also had Bonapartists, supporters of Napoleon, out-and-out Republicans, this is maybe all more on the radical revolutionary side, and a group of people who, for the first time, began to call themselves liberals and follow this program of protecting individual rights. And one of the first thinkers to call himself this was an important thinker named Benjamin Constant, who was his dates are 1767 to 1830. He was actually Swiss, but he's a French writer. And like other French liberals, he was someone who favored an English-style parliamentary government, middle-class parliament. 19th century liberals, by the way, did not like democracy at all. They were fearful of mob action. They were fearful of the excesses of the revolution, basically. They remembered all that stuff and favored protections for individual freedom of the press, religion, and were for things like education. They didn't want uneducated people voting, working class people, stuff like that. And Constant, his political liberalism, remember last time we talked about that distinction between political and religious liberalism, I'm talking about political liberalism here. If you're thinking of liberalism in terms of John Locke, it's a little different. John Locke's liberalism, he never used the term, but it's basically the same thing. But his Locke's ideas were philosophically motivated. His empiricism, his idea that all knowledge came through experience, sensory experience, his idea of the blank slate, that we're not born with any innate ideas. These things fed into his liberalism. Whereas Constant, instead of appealing to philosophy, appealed to history to justify his program. He wrote a famous essay called The Liberty of the Ancients and the Moderns, in which he argued that people in a modern society couldn't exercise liberty the same way people had in the ancient world. Because in the ancient world, ancient Greece and Rome, Roman Republic, these ancient republics were based on slavery and the subjection of the many, in order to provide the few the leisure to be citizens actively engaged in public life. So liberty is a public thing in the ancient world because of this. In modern societies, which are based on commerce rather than slavery, according to Constant, you have the reverse. Instead, you have a more powerful state, and therefore what you have is a negative liberty, which is meant to free people from that state, which meant that private life was sort of raised to a higher standard in Constant's mind, and which he valued as protecting private life. In other words, liberty is not to protect the public exercise of something, it's to protect the private privacy of people in some ways. And the other difference, of course, is that for Constant, this is now open to the many rather than the few. He sees this as a gain in some ways. And so it mocks out his philosophy as being very modern. It meant a lot of areas that were, might have been seen as public before, like religion, were not kind of seen private as a result of this philosophy. So he's an important thinker who, by the way, won't totally directly influence Catholic liberalism, but it's in the background of this stuff, so I need to mention it. Can't go without it. And so in this restored monarchy in France, you also have one other force that, besides liberalism as a political and sort of intellectual force, that shapes into Catholic liberalism. And the other big force is a cultural one, and that would be Romanticism. You probably got some of this in high school, if you know what Romanticism is. It is a reaction in pretty much all areas of life. A lot of times you get this recitation of like literary or artistic movements, but it's really in all areas of life, against Enlightenment notions of rationality, against overweening notions of reason and rationality, notions of rationality that rule out things like faith, or rule out things like, anything that's not rational is somehow bad or non-existent. And in its place, you get, as a reaction to this, an emphasis on feelings, intuition, holistic perspectives on the world, rather than the sort of logic chopping, sort of categorization you get from a lot of Renaissance, Enlightenment thinkers. And this meant in art, by the way, a rebellion against the artistic movements of the 18th century, like classicism, which everything has to be sort of restrained in terms of art and form and architecture, literature. In its place, an exuberance, right? A taste for the exotic, the passionate, but also for the past, the distant past especially, a longing for an earlier, simpler era, especially the medieval era. This is the age of medievalism. If you like your local Renaissance fair, you can thank Romanticism for that, because it sweeps across Western Europe and the United States and gives people a sensibility which looks toward the past for inspiration. That, in short, is Romanticism. One thing you're probably not aware of, though, is that this also affects how religion is practiced pretty much throughout the Western world. And it's really hard to explain, actually, if you read works on religious life before the early 19th century. It's very different. People don't think in religion the same ways. I mean, religion for people, I studied the 17th century in my specialty, my graduate study work, and people like John Locke, to go back to him, religion is mostly about doctrine. It's about knowing the truth, and it's mostly an intellectual thing. And what's going to happen with Romanticism, all this emphasis on feeling and intuition, is going to reshape how people practice and experience their religious faith. And this will directly feed into Catholic liberalism. One of the big bestsellers of the Restoration era, even before Restoration era, in France, is a book called The Genius of Christianity, published in 1803, shortly after Napoleon took power, by René Chateaubriand. Chateaubriand was a nobleman, was an ardent Catholic, who wrote this work of apologetics, which he exalts what he calls the genius of Christianity, but particularly he's talking about Catholicism, not because of the truth of its doctrines or things of this nature, but because of its beauty, because of the beauty of its liturgy and its rituals. And becomes a bestseller, by the way. It's widely popular. It's the first work, really best work that sold in France following the Revolution that took a positive outlook on the church. And you can also see this, by the way, in the work on religion by Benjamin Constant, I mentioned earlier. He's a Swiss, he's a Protestant, but he has similar things to say. I mean, literally, Constant writes a big multi-volume work in the 1820s called De la Religion, on religion, where he basically just out and out identifies religion with feeling. Here's a quotation from it. Quote, "The religious sentiment is an emotion of the same type as all our natural emotions. It is always in agreement, in consequence, with sympathy, pity, and justice. In a word, with all the virtues." For Constant, it is basically feeling and sentiment. This is part of a much wider trend, by the way. It's not just happening in France. It's happening everywhere. This tendency to see faith, religion, as something that primarily induces subjective psychological states. In the Protestant world, the person who's most famously alive with this idea is Friedrich Schleiermacher, who is the sort of progenitor, the godfather of liberal Protestantism. He identifies true religion with feeling and subjectivity. Not quite the same thing, and this actually starts a little earlier in the Protestant world than it does in the Catholic world, but same time frame, 1801. In America, you have the first wave of revivals in the backcountry of Kentucky and places like that, Pennsylvania, which will come in time to be baptized with the name of the Second Great Awakening. And again, this is kind of the same thing. We have people they're having these emotional experiences in this mass setting in America. But this is, again, my point is this is a pan-Western phenomenon of appealing to emotion this way. And it's kind of part and parcel of this. Sometimes Romanticism is called a revolutionary movement for this reason. But again, it shows you kind of religion being pushed toward this more subjective, more private notion in terms of how people conceive of it here. Well, that's not totally true in the case of Chateaubriand or even Constant, but still it has a tendency to do that. And Constant's idea of religion is, again, in the mainstream of sort of liberal thinking at that time in that sense. So a little bit different than the political version, but it's part of the religious version in that era. And this also goes along with social changes. I had to mention this here because I don't want to overemphasize class, but this Romanticism does tend to go along with the newly emergent middle classes of Europe and the United States. In France, especially, the legal emancipation of the bourgeoisie coincides, of course, with their economic emergence in the late 18th and early 19th century. The emergence of an industrial society, right, where you have classes instead of orders. Like, again, what's the difference, right? Class, estate, order. In the old system, you're part of a group by birth. If you're born a peasant, you're not clergy, you cannot move out of that group. It's primarily a matter of birth in that regard, where the other system, it's a matter of your occupation in life. And of course, with the end of this legal status, because in the old regime, the middle classes, to be clear, you could be middle class in economic terms. You could have a ton of money as a merchant or a tradesman or a lawyer, and yet still have lots of restrictions on your freedom because you were born in that class. With all that going away, the middle classes begin to take on a self-conscious identity as a class, opposed to the aristocracy, opposed to the working classes. And this emancipation from legal restrictions dovetails with the emancipation I should say, emancipating from the legal subordination of aristocrats. That's one thing, of course, they resented, but it also leads to being emancipated from the need to marry for money, right? Marriage for love, romantic marriage, is largely a creation of the middle classes in the early 19th century, both in Europe and America. This is something that's pointed out by Alexis de Tocqueville, the great political thinker. He's also a French liberal Catholic. He's also an aristocrat, but he talks about this in his work, Democracy in America, about how democratic societies where they no longer feel the need, right, to make marriage alliances for status reasons. They want to marry for equality of feeling and for love and stuff like that. It's part and parcel of this. You have this more emotional sense of personal freedom being created by this. And I'm mentioning all this because by the time the middle classes emerge really full blown in the 1820s and 30s in France and elsewhere, they're a minority. Let me put this clear, they're still a minority. And even within the middle classes, let me be clear about this as well, there's still a hierarchy within the middle classes. The people at the top of the rung, the intellectuals, the wealthy, the wealthy tradesmen, the lawyers, people with education, they look down on the lower middle class people and the working class. It's only this tiny minority, but now they're a very influential minority in government, in things like law and other things like this, who are now educated, self-confident, and here's the key thing, very unwilling to take instruction from priests on things like politics, which they see now as a birthright to decide for themselves. This, of course, clashes mightily with the conception of authority that the church, ever since the Reformation, in response to the Protestant sort of rejection of its authority, ever since then, the Catholic Church has really exalted that conception of authority. And look, for obvious reasons, for a long time in the Middle Ages, the church, priests, clergy were used to basically telling people what to do because they're the only educated people in the society. Well, of course, that's changed by the 19th century. Especially because since the revolution in France, the upper echelons of that educational system there had been secularized. Not the lower, not primary education, not yet. That'll take several decades, but they had now the highest schools in the land were the école started by Napoleon and his predecessors, basically to raise up people for the imperial regime, creates a whole generation. By the time we get to the Restoration era, a whole generation of intellectuals, government officials, civil servants, who had effectively been raised to despise the church. And though they are small in number, they are very influential in society. I'll give you one example of this. Adrien Dancet, who's a French historian of religion, told a story of a civil servant who in the late 1790s, before Napoleon took over, was religious. So he went to Mass. When he went to Mass, he always hid behind a pillar in the church to make sure he wasn't seen by anyone. Because if he was seen by anyone, he would be ruined and his career would be over. So that's what the church is up against, even after the church is restored and the monarchy is restored in 1814, 1815. So that's the backdrop we wanted to get to. After all that, what's going on with the French church in the early 18 teens, which leads to the birth of Catholic liberalism in that period? Well, first of all, after all that, after talking about how the French Revolution emancipated the middle classes and now they don't want to have to deal with aristocrats or clergy telling them what to do, well, who do you think most of the bishops are who run the church in France in 1814, 1815? If you guessed, you're right. Yeah, it's mostly aristocrats. Some of the bishops actually had been bishops before the revolution in 1789. They're that old. Moreover, when the Bourbons are brought back in 1814, they see the church do the Bourbon, but also most churchmen do. They see the church as a prop for both the monarchy and aristocracy. They see rebellion against social order as the greatest ill, for very understandable reasons, by the way. And so they're intent on trying to restore as much of that as they can. In other words, you have a very reactionary body of people in the church governing it, when all this is taking place. Moreover, there was a severe shortage of clergy in that period because seminaries were closed. You couldn't ordain people under the Revolution. Even under Napoleon, clerical education had suffered mightily. Seminary training was very meager, and it was largely, several decades behind the times. Instead of, dealing with contemporary thought and trying to engage with it, they were still reading and writing against authors who had been dead since the 1780s and 90s. And this meant that young seminarians, in a lot of ways, were left very, very, very intellectually unprepared to deal with them. People like Ernest Renan. Ernest Renan is, if you don't know who that is, it's a French thinker who became a free thinker later in his life, but was a seminarian in the Restoration period. He wrote about this later in his life, about how bad the education was in these seminaries, what led him losing his faith. And so the church, a lot of its priests are just kind of defenseless against these new streams of thought, which are so antithetical to the church and the faith. This is why, in the early part of the Restoration, many of the most important writers who defended the church in that era were laymen. There was a group of them who collaborated on various literary endeavors, and a few, such as Chateaubriand, who were also politicians in Parliament trying to support the monarchy that way, and the church at the same time. Some of these authors were really brilliant, these reactionary thinkers. That's what they are, is reactionaries. Two men stand out here I'll mention, because they will feed directly into Catholic liberalism. One is Louis-Gabriel Ambroise de Bonald, a nobleman who's also a politician in Parliament in the teens and 20s, and then Joseph de Maistre, who is a diplomat in the Kingdom of Piedmont, was French by birth. And de Maistre, I'll start with him first, as someone who, and both of these thinkers I'm talking about here, will seek explanations for the faith and reasons to defend the church that tend to downplay reason, probably, I think, because the irreligious had sort of colonized rationalism from the Enlightenment onward. And so someone like de Maistre, who was in exile most of his adult life from France, argued that the social order itself, society itself, was of divine origin, that God himself had given it its sort of blueprint. And this included a divinely ordained hierarchy of monarchy, church, and everything else. He saw providence as the guiding principle of history and society. In his view, the revolution had been a divine punishment for France's sins. Its sins, by the way, were mostly in overthrowing their anointed monarch. And de Maistre thought that human society, because human reason had been so weakened by the fall of man, that human beings were so depraved, that human society needed an absolute authority to guide it, otherwise it would collapse. Again, he's thinking about the revolution. And for him, this authority came not necessarily from the monarchy, but from the church, and in particular, the Pope. Remember last time I talked about the idea of ultramontanism, which is a really exalted view of papal authority? Joseph de Maistre is the ultra of ultramontanists. It is basically papal supremacy on steroids. There was a film years ago, I don't know if I look this up or anything, called Becket. It was about Thomas the Becket, the medieval saint. And there was a line by one of the bishops in that film, Bishop Folliot of London, was an actual person, in which he says, I'm quoting this from memory because it encapsulates what de Maistre thought about the church. He said, quote, what is important is revealed, this is the line in the film, not de Maistre. Folliot said, what is important is revealed to man only through his church, in the person of our Holy Father in Rome, his bishops and his priests, unquote. That idea that basically all authority, all knowledge, all of the faith descends from the Pope himself down through his priests, down through his bishops, his priests, to everybody else. That's the sort of ultramontanism I'm talking about. It's very exaggerated. But he's doing that in response to the chaos of the preceding several decades. De Bono was another thinker who thought along similar lines. He thought, more particularly, he thought that his idea of society is one in which the community took total precedence over the individual. Again, they're both, him and de Maistre, reacting against what they perceive as the individualism run rampant of the Enlightenment, of the philosophes that they think caused the revolution. And for de Bono, men only come to know truth in society and not by individual reason. De Bono thought, like de Maistre, that society was the product of divine intelligence. God, in the beginning, when he created, human society, laid down immutable principles to man by giving them language. And these immutable principles are conveyed to men through tradition, which can be deduced, I guess, from the nature of society, but like mathematical theorems. And so this is aimed at these, Enlightenment theories of very rationalistic, individualistic forms of reasoning. And so for de Bono, it's only from tradition one can attain truth, not from reason. And again, if you remember what I talked about last time, again, I mentioned some of those streams of thought that flow into Catholic liberalism, two of them in particular, right? Fideism, right? The idea that you need some sort of authority because reason is so weak to find out truth. On the other hand, traditionalism, the idea that, truth without supernatural, order can only be found out through the tradition of the church, not through reason. These are both what will eventually be condemned as heresies, but they're kind of been there in Nietzsche in the thought of these two very brilliant thinkers, by the way, who did a good turn for the church. I don't want to criticize them too much. De Maistre especially, actually, they're both really influential. Far beyond, by the way, the circles they ran in. De Bono influenced all sorts of thinkers you wouldn't even think of in the 19th century. And de Maistre is known, among other things, for being a great French prose stylist. He's definitely still read today as a sort of canon of sort of conservative thinkers. My point is, both of these men will feed into the thought of the person who is responsible for founding what we call the Catholic liberal movement of the 19th century, especially de Bono, who was a contemporary of him. They're thinking especially about society, especially about the need for authority, especially about the weakness of reason, and the necessity of having an authority, will feed into the thought of a man named Félicité Robert de Lamennais, the Abbé de Lamennais. And he's the one who in the 1820s, who will begin and use the word liberal in connection with Catholicism. And that's where I'm going to stop right here. That's the sort of background. You've gotten all this sort of intellectual stuff, the social stuff, because what's going to happen is, I'll preview it for you, Lamennais will become the first major clerical writer in the restored monarchy in France. He'll publish a best-selling work. He'll become popular with the public. He seems to get the attention of the secular world. This is one of the things that the church is concerned about. And what you're going to see is that he starts out as a sort of reactionary in political terms, like de Bono and de Maistre. However, by the 1820s, for a variety of reasons, he'll get the idea that, no, we don't need to have the restored sort of throne and altar regime where church and state support each other. They can be separated. He'll found a Catholic movement, which urges the church to do that. What's going to happen, you'll find out, of course, go from there. His thought will be condemned by the Pope, and he will eventually leave the church altogether and die outside of it. So that is next time when we talk about the Abbé de Lamennais and the origins of French liberalism. And that is our podcast for this time. Hopefully give you some background, stuff to think about for next time. The next one will probably drop after, today is Wednesday, probably after Easter, probably Monday after Easter. So I want to wish all of you out there, my listeners, thank you so much for listening, supporting the podcast. I really appreciate it. May God richly bless you all. Have a wonderful Triduism, a wonderful Easter with your friends and family. And we'll hear from me soon. See y'all next time. God bless you and take care.